When I moved into her house, she told me one rule: stay quiet upstairs. But late at night, I heard something that made silence impossible, and changed everything between us. I still remember the weight of that first evening when I carried my bags up the stone steps of her townhouse. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own footsteps echo, and I wondered for a moment if I'd made a mistake agreeing to rent this place. Then the door opened, and there she was. My landlady. She looked nothing like what I had pictured in my head. I expected someone brisk, businesslike, maybe even distant. Instead, she greeted me with a warm but measured smile, the kind of smile that doesn't give itself away too easily. She was elegant in a natural, unforced way, simple clothes, hair swept back casually, but there was something about the calm steadiness in her eyes that made me pause before I even stepped inside. "Come in," she said, her voice low and even, like it carried more history than she would ever let on in a first conversation. The house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old books, and though it was tidy, there was an air of lived-in comfort. She gave me the quick tour: the kitchen with its soft yellow light, the narrow stairwell creaking under our steps, the small room upstairs that would be mine. Her words were practical, but her presence wasn't. I kept noticing the way she would gesture towards something, her hand brushing lightly against the doorframe, or the way she glanced at me sideways to make sure I was following. When she handed me the keys, our fingers touched for just a second longer than necessary. It was nothing, really, just skin against skin, but I felt the warmth of it as though she had pressed something into my palm besides a set of metal keys. "Make yourself at home," she said. And then, almost as an afterthought, her lips curving into something between amusement and warning, "Just, stay quiet upstairs." I wasn't sure what she meant. Maybe she'd had noisy tenants before. Maybe it was her way of keeping boundaries clear. But the way she said it, with that faint glimmer in her eyes, made it feel less like a rule and more like a secret. I nodded, pretending not to think twice about it. But even as I unpacked my bags in the little room with the slanted ceiling, I couldn't shake the sense that she was more than just a landlady. She was a presence. A quiet gravity I hadn't expected. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew her single rule would be harder to follow than she realized. The first night passed without much thought. I was still settling in, arranging my books, listening to the faint hum of the city through the window. The house was old, and old houses creak and sigh in their own ways. I told myself that's all it was. But on the second night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I heard it. At first, it was faint, a low, muffled sound drifting upward from the floorboards. I thought maybe it was the pipes or the heating. I turned over, pressing my ear to the pillow, hoping it would fade. Instead, it grew clearer. Not loud, not sharp, but human. A soft sound. A sigh, maybe. Or a moan. It unsettled me more than it should have. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that made me hyper-aware of every breath I took, every movement I made. The walls between us suddenly felt too thin, as if her presence downstairs was closer than I had realized when she first welcomed me in. I shifted in bed, trying to ignore it, telling myself I was imagining things. But the rhythm of it, the rise and fall, was too distinct. She was there. Awake. And not as composed as the woman I'd met earlier in the day. When morning came, I half expected her to look different, to seem embarrassed or awkward. But she didn't. She stood at the counter with her coffee, her robe tied neatly, her expression calm and unreadable. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her tone casual, like we were strangers meeting in a hotel lobby. I hesitated before answering. Maybe I was reading too much into everything. Maybe it was nothing. But then she glanced up at me, her eyes locking onto mine with a knowing flicker. And that's when she said it again, the words that had already taken root in my mind: "Stay quiet upstairs." She said it with a little half-smile this time, as though she wasn't just reminding me of a house rule, but testing me. Her voice lingered in the space between us, carrying a kind of weight I couldn't define. I laughed nervously, trying to play it off. But she didn't laugh back. She just sipped her coffee, her lips curved, her gaze steady, like she knew something I didn't. That day, as I left the house, the echo of her voice followed me down the street. I told myself not to think about it. But the truth was, I couldn't stop. Her words weren't just a rule anymore. They were an invitation. Or maybe, a challenge. It was a Saturday afternoon when it happened, the first small moment that shifted the ground beneath us. I had been heading down the stairs when I found her in the hallway, arms folded, staring up at the shelf above the coat rack. A cardboard box sat just out of her reach. She noticed me instantly and let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I should have thought ahead before shoving it up there," she murmured. "Would you mind?" I stepped closer, brushing past her lightly as I reached up. The box wasn't heavy, but the narrow space made me conscious of how near we stood. Her shoulder brushed my arm, her perfume, something faint and floral, rising in the warm stillness between us. "Got it," I said, lowering the box. She steadied it with her hands as I passed it down, her fingers brushing across mine. Just a touch. Accidental, maybe. But it was enough to make me pause. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine for a heartbeat longer than felt ordinary. There was no mask in that moment, no careful composure. Just, her. I carried the box into the living room for her, and she followed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear as she moved. She sat on the couch and began sifting through the contents, old photo albums, folded papers, little pieces of her life. I hovered awkwardly, unsure if I should leave. "You can sit," she said finally, her voice calm but inviting. "Unless you've got somewhere to be." I sat. Not too close, but close enough to see the way her expression softened as she lifted a photograph from the pile. She smiled at it, though it was tinged with something heavier. A memory, maybe. A loss. "You look different when you smile like that," I said without thinking. She looked at me, startled, then laughed, almost shyly. "Different good or different strange?" "Good," I replied. My voice was quieter than I meant it to be. For a while, we just sat there. Not talking, not moving, just sharing the quiet space. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt steady. Like a line had been crossed, but gently. When I finally stood to leave, she reached out, her hand brushing my forearm in a light, almost hesitant touch. "Thanks again," she said, her voice softer now. It was the first time her gratitude felt less like formality and more like connection. And as I went back upstairs, I realized that the house no longer felt like just her home. Somehow, piece by piece, it was becoming ours. A few nights later, she knocked on my door just as I was finishing some work at my desk. Her voice carried through the wood, low and steady. "I made too much food. Come down, if you'd like." There was nothing formal about the invitation, but the way she lingered outside my door told me it wasn't entirely casual either. When I entered the dining room, the table surprised me. 2 plates already set, candles lit, and music playing softly in the background, an old jazz record, its warmth filling the space like an extra presence. "It's just dinner," she said quickly, perhaps noticing my expression. "Don't read too much into it." But the little smile tugging at her lips betrayed her words. We sat across from each other, and for the first time, it didn't feel like landlady and tenant. It felt like 2 people simply sharing an evening. The food was simple but comforting, and the wine loosened the edges of our conversation. At first we talked about ordinary things, work, the neighborhood, the creaky pipes that always woke her at night. But slowly, the words shifted, deepened. She spoke about her life in fragments, about chances she hadn't taken, about how silence in the house could feel heavy sometimes. I listened, and I saw her differently that night, not as someone who had everything figured out, but as someone who carried her solitude with quiet dignity. "You're not what I expected in a tenant," she admitted, swirling the last of the wine in her glass. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" I asked. She tilted her head, studying me, eyes softened by candlelight. Ask me again when you've lived here a little longer. Her teasing made me bolder. So, about that rule you keep repeating. Staying quiet upstairs. Her lips curved, caught between amusement and embarrassment. You heard something, didn't you? She asked, lowering her gaze just for a moment. I hesitated, then nodded. I thought it was the house at first. But then, she interrupted, laughing softly, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. You should mind your own business. Not if you keep making it impossible, I replied, half joking, though my voice betrayed more truth than I intended. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. If anything, it pulsed with unspoken understanding. She looked at me for a long moment, her fingers brushing the stem of her glass, and for the first time, I felt that invisible line between us blur just a little more. When the night ended and I climbed the stairs, I carried her laughter with me, softer, freer, and somehow meant for me alone. That night after dinner, I thought I would go straight upstairs and retreat to the safety of my room. But when she followed me to the stairwell, the air between us shifted. The house was hushed, the only sound a faint crackle of the record still spinning in the background. The narrow hallway light cast soft shadows, wrapping us in a kind of cocoon. She stood just a step below me, close enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to meet her eyes. Her robe brushed against the wooden railing, and the faintest scent of her perfume rose in the stillness, familiar now, but somehow sharper, more intimate. Good night, she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. Good night, I echoed. But neither of us moved. I could feel the warmth of her presence in a way that was almost physical, the subtle brush of her sleeve against my arm, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the awareness of how little space separated us. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, unbearable quiet. And yet it carried more weight than any words could. She looked like she wanted to say something. Her lips parted, her gaze flickering to mine, then away again. I thought maybe she would confess something, or maybe scold me for what I'd hinted at during dinner. But instead, she shook her head with a small, self-conscious smile. You should get some rest, she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. I wanted to say something back, something honest. That I didn't want to go upstairs. That I didn't want this moment to end. But the words stuck in my throat, caught somewhere between courage and caution. So we just stood there, a breath apart, a pause stretched thin with unspoken feelings. My hand hovered near the railing, and hers settled just inches away. Our fingers didn't touch, but the nearness was enough to make my pulse race, enough to make me wonder if she could hear it. Finally, she stepped back. Just one step, but it was enough to shatter the fragile spell. Good night, she repeated, softer this time. I nodded and climbed the last few stairs, feeling the emptiness of each step pulling me further from her. When I reached the top, I glanced back. She was still there, watching, though the shadows had softened her features into something unreadable. That night, lying awake in the quiet of my room, I realized the silence between us was louder than any sound I'd heard from downstairs. And I wasn't sure how much longer either of us could keep holding it back. It happened a few nights later. I had been reading upstairs when I heard it again, that sound drifting upward through the floorboards. Softer this time, but still enough to make me set my book aside. It wasn't the creak of pipes, and it wasn't the wind. It was unmistakably her. A sigh, drawn out, aching. For a moment, I sat frozen, torn between pretending I hadn't heard and giving in to the pull that had been building for days. My better judgment told me to stay in my room, but my heart, or maybe my curiosity, led me down the stairs. I stopped outside her door, my hand hovering over the wood. I almost turned back. But before I could, the door opened. She stood there, startled, her robe loosely tied, eyes widening at the sight of me. I thought I was being quiet, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her admission caught me off guard. She wasn't defensive, wasn't angry. She looked almost embarrassed, her cheeks tinged with color. For the first time, she seemed less like the composed, untouchable woman I had known and more like someone caught in her own solitude. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said quickly. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Her gaze softened at that, and something in her posture shifted. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she let out a breath that sounded more like relief than frustration. "I forget how thin these walls are," she murmured. Then, after a pause, her eyes flicked to mine. "It's not easy, being in this house alone." That simple confession held more weight than anything else she had told me. For a long moment, we just stood there, the quiet stretching out, heavy but tender. Instinctively, I reached for her hand. I half expected her to pull away, to retreat behind the careful walls she always carried. But she didn't. Her fingers trembled slightly, then curled around mine, fragile but deliberate. The warmth of her touch spread through me, grounding me in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't bold. It wasn't reckless. It was just real. We didn't speak after that. We didn't need to. I could feel the honesty in the way her hand lingered in mine, in the way her eyes shimmered with something unguarded. For the first time, the silence between us wasn't a boundary. It was a bridge. And as I stood there, holding her hand in the dim light of the hallway, I knew the distance we had been keeping could never fully return. In the days that followed, something shifted between us. It wasn't drastic, no sudden declarations, no dramatic gestures. It was subtler than that. The way she lingered in the kitchen when I came downstairs. The way her hand would brush mine when passing a mug of coffee. The quiet glances that held just a little longer than before. The house itself felt different. Less like a set of walls dividing two lives, and more like a space quietly drawing us together. The silence between us no longer pressed down heavily, it felt alive, full of possibility. One evening, I came down the stairs and found her waiting at the bottom, leaning lightly against the banister. She looked up at me with a smile that was small, almost shy, but full of something I hadn't seen before, ease. "You're not very good at following rules," she teased softly. I laughed under my breath. "Then maybe you should stop making ones I can't keep." She shook her head, but her smile stayed. And then she stepped closer. Just one step, but it closed the distance we had been dancing around for so long. Without thinking, I reached for her, and this time she didn't retreat. Her arms slipped around my waist, her cheek resting lightly against my chest. The warmth of her pressed against me, steady and sure, and for a moment, the world outside that old townhouse didn't exist. Her heartbeat was soft but certain, and I realized mine had finally slowed to match it. I let my hand settle at the small of her back, feeling the way she melted just slightly into the embrace. "You don't have to stay quiet anymore," she whispered, her words muffled against me. It wasn't a dramatic confession, but it didn't need to be. It was permission. It was trust. It was the beginning of something neither of us had dared to name until now. We stood there in the hallway, not rushing, not explaining, not defining what would come next. Just breathing together, holding on to the stillness that finally felt like ours to share. When she pulled back at last, she looked up at me with a smile that reached her eyes. A smile that said, "Yes, you belong here." And in that quiet, I knew the rule that had once felt like a boundary had become something else entirely, an invitation to step closer, and to stay. If this story touched you, don't forget to give it a like and share it with someone who loves slow burn romance as much as you do. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt age gap love stories, and let me know in the comments what moment stayed with you the most.